You were taught this, that Britain entered the First World War simply because of alliances, honor, and a straightforward sense of duty. That the world erupted into conflict in Britain as the noble empire stepped in to defend Belgium and uphold international law. That's the story most of us have grown up with, neatly packaged, morally satisfying, and safe. It's tidy, but history, as you'll soon see, is rarely tidy. It is messy, contradictory, and often uncomfortable. And in the case of Britain's entry into the Great War, what you've been told conceals more than it reveals. Picture this: August 1914. Headlines screamed of German aggression, of Belgium violated and Europe under threat. The narrative we inherit casts Britain as a reluctant hero, caught between principle and necessity. Political speeches celebrated honor and commitment to treaties. Schoolbooks paint prime ministers and generals as men of conscience, stoically weighing the fate of a continent before declaring war. It's an image that comforts us because it fits the framework we expect. Disciplined Britain, measured, moral, rising to a challenge. You hear this version and you think, of course Britain entered the war. It was inevitable. It was justified, but let that sink in. Inevitable, justified, noble. These words are precisely the ones that obscure the more complex, less flattering truth. Most of us have never been asked to consider the political maneuvering behind the scenes. The quiet calculations made in smoke-filled rooms, away from the public eye. We are told Britain acted to protect Belgium, yet the corridors of power tell a different story. Fear of German dominance, economic concerns, colonial leverage, and military preparedness, or lack thereof, loomed large. The narrative we consume simplifies these into moral imperatives, and therein lies the first illusion. The story you know is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. It frames events in human terms: honor, duty, loyalty. It hides the more strategic, almost clinical calculations that truly influenced Britain's decision. The myth is comforting because it allows us to see Britain as exceptional. It portrays British discipline as flawless, almost heroic, contrasting with the arrogance and misjudgments of continental powers. And yet this framing diminishes the stakes. It ignores the immense pressures, the real dangers, the moral ambiguities faced by decision-makers who were not always certain of the outcome. You're meant to admire the decision, not question it. But here's the part most people miss. The entry into the war was not preordained. It was debated, resisted, delayed, and complicated by doubts and divisions that would have been disastrous if mishandled. Britain's supposed inevitability was, in reality, precarious. This is where everything changes. The version of history you've been told is a tidy story of noble duty. It's a story designed to comfort, to reassure, to allow generations to view Britain's role as measured, disciplined, and morally sound. And that is precisely why the hidden elements are so important. To understand Britain's entry into the First World War, we must first confront the myth itself. Only then can we peel back the layers, examine the cracks, and see the real forces at play, forces that were not just strategic, but psychological, moral, and deeply human. The discipline you admire, the calm authority you imagine, was not absolute. It was tested, compromised, and stretched to its limits, and the arrogance you assume belonged to others. Well, it was present on all sides, often underestimated and dangerous. By the end of this exploration, you will not look at August 1914 in quite the same way. You will understand how narratives of heroism and inevitability shape our memory of events. You will see that the hidden truths of Britain's entry into the war are not less dramatic. They are simply more honest. You will begin to appreciate the calculated endurance, the moral tension, and the quiet, formidable discipline that truly decided the course of history. For now, consider this your introduction. The myth is only the beginning. And if you want to see more truths hidden by history, follow along with Britain at War Here's, the part most people miss. The neat story of Britain's noble entry into the First World War doesn't quite hold when you look at the details. There was hesitation, debate, and hesitation again. Men in high office, the same ones lauded for courage and duty, were unsure whether Britain should step onto the continent at all. The myth suggests inevitability. The reality is far messier. Political leaders, military advisors, and diplomats were weighing risks, questioning alliances, and quietly worrying about the army's readiness. This is the crack in the story, the place where the tidy narrative begins to unravel. Most histories gloss over this. They tell you Britain entered to defend Belgium and uphold treaties. That's true on paper, but not in spirit. The truth is, the British cabinet wrestled with alternatives. Some argued for neutrality, believing that a continental war could be contained without Britain's direct involvement. Others warned that German dominance in Europe would threaten trade, colonies, and national security in ways more immediate than any moral obligation. These debates were not abstract. Every hour of delay, every hesitant telegram, shifted the balance of power on the ground. The decisions that seem clear in hindsight were far from obvious at the time, and here's where authority begins to be reversed. You've been told Britain acted decisively, morally, and rightly, but historians examining cabinet minutes and private correspondence reveal a very different picture. The decision to go to war was as much about pressure, bluff, and posturing as it was about principle. Leaders were acutely aware of public opinion, of parliament, of the press, and of each other. Some were reluctant, some were cautious, and some knew that the country was not militarily prepared for the commitment they were about to make. The disciplined, inevitable heroism presented in school books. It was, at this stage, fragile, precarious, and heavily influenced by anxiety. Even the famous Belgian ultimatum, the rallying point of the narrative, was not so straightforward. Belgium's plight provided a convenient moral framing, but it also masked the deeper calculations. Britain needed to act in a way that would justify intervention, not simply in moral terms, but in the eyes of Europe and the Empire. This is psychological warfare at the highest level, shaping perception, managing morale, and creating a story that would unify the nation behind a choice that was far from universally popular in cabinet. The narrative presented to the public concealed the uncertainty and tension behind closed doors. It gave the impression of clarity where there was only debate. Discipline versus arrogance again comes into play. British leaders had to maintain a calm exterior while uncertainty and fear swirled beneath the surface. Their continental counterparts, by contrast, often acted with overconfidence, assuming Britain would hesitate, assuming the empire would falter. And in some ways they were right, but only if the cracks in Britain's resolve had widened. The British ability to mask hesitation, to project discipline, and to ultimately decide in favor of intervention was as much psychological as it was strategic. It was a quiet, high-stakes exercise in endurance, bluff, and nerve. This is where the story shifts. The crack shows that history is rarely as straightforward as the textbooks claim. It forces us to question what we believe about morality, inevitability, and heroism. Britain's entry into the war was not a simple act of duty. It was a product of pressure, calculation, and the careful balancing of appearances. It was a moment where hesitation and courage intersected, where moral framing and strategic necessity collided. And it is in this tension, the crack between myth and reality, that the true story begins to emerge. And this is exactly the place to pause, to notice the uncertainty, and to prepare for what Britain actually endured behind the scenes. And now, the reality. Britain's entry into the First World War was not a ceremonial gesture or a simple act of moral duty. It was a choice weighed under pressure, executed under uncertainty, and carried by men and institutions stretched to their limits. While the myth frames Britain as a confident, inevitable actor, the truth is that the country's leadership and armed forces faced an unprecedented test of endurance, strategy, and discipline. Let that sink in. This was not a symbolic march into war. It was a measured, calculated, and painstaking step into the unknown, with consequences that would last generations. Consider the British Army at the time. It was neither vast nor fully prepared for the scale of continental warfare that was unfolding. The numbers were small, resources were limited, and the men, though professional, had trained for colonial campaigns, not the industrialized slaughter Europe was about to see. Yet the cabinet decided the risk had to be taken. The army was mobilized, trains rolled through the night, and men departed knowing that their discipline would be tested in ways they could not imagine. The facade of inevitability masked months of preparation, logistical stress, and the quiet fear that Britain might not be ready. Behind the headlines, planners were calculating supply lines, rationing, and troop movements. They were assessing the enemy's strength, reading intelligence reports, and adjusting strategies hour by hour. This was endurance in its purest form, an intellectual, administrative, and moral struggle, long before the first shots were fired. Commanders were making decisions that could not be reversed, weighing risks to men and equipment against the strategic necessity of confronting Germany. Every telegram, every report, carried the weight of potential catastrophe. And yet from the outside, it looked seamless, orderly, disciplined, and inevitable. That is the psychological reality. The impression of calm hides the strain and uncertainty beneath. Discipline versus arrogance plays out here in a subtle, almost invisible way. German planners often assumed Britain would hesitate or falter, believing that the empire's logistical and political complexities would delay or even prevent intervention. They misjudged not only the resolve of the British cabinet, but the quiet tenacity of the army and the bureaucracy that supported it. Britain's apparent calm was hard-won, a product of preparation, endurance, and a culture of measured, strategic decision-making. In many ways, this discipline was the true weapon, far more decisive than the numbers on paper, and it was not merely logistics that defined the reality. psychological pressure was constant. Ministers knew that public opinion could shift, that dissent within parliament could derail plans, and that any misstep might embolden Germany or demoralize allies. Morale, both at home and abroad, had to be managed with as much care as troops in the field. The reality of leadership in 1914 was the quiet management of fear, the endurance of uncertainty, and the steadfast projection of authority. Every action, every word, every telegram was part of a calculated strategy to keep Britain ready and the enemy unsure. Here's the part most people miss. Britain's entry into the war was a demonstration of endurance over numbers, preparation over arrogance, and discipline over chaos. The myth of effortless heroism obscures this. The men who ordered mobilization, who directed logistics, who faced the consequences of delay, were operating under conditions that demanded extraordinary psychological resilience. They were bearing the weight of a nation's expectations while knowing that mistakes could be catastrophic. That, more than anything, defines the reality of Britain's first steps into World War I. And this is why understanding the reality is crucial. It sets the stage for the struggles that followed, the long, hard tests of terrain, weather, and battle that would define the war. The decisions made in those early days, under pressure and uncertainty, would shape not only the course of the campaign but the very narrative we think we know. For those who wish to see history as it truly was, pay attention closely. The hidden truth is far more compelling than the myths. And this is where it becomes tangible. The myth and the reality give way to something far more visceral, the struggle itself. Britain was now committed, boots on the ground, and yet the campaign was not a series of heroic charges or clean victories. It was mud, rain, fog, waiting, and the relentless tension of anticipation. The soldiers faced terrain that was unforgiving, whether that seemed determined to sap morale, and an enemy who would not hesitate. Discipline was tested not only against the opposition, but against the environment, the hours, the endless grind of preparation and expectation. Picture the fields and forests of northern France and Belgium. Rivers swollen with rain, roads churned to mud by wheels and feet, and trenches barely dug before the first confrontation. Soldiers huddled under tarpaulins, weapons close, eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy might appear at any moment. The air was thick with anticipation and with fear. Every step forward was hard graft, every night spent on watch and exercise and endurance. Discipline became a shield against panic. Without it, the psychological strain alone could have shattered units before they even faced the enemy. Here's the part most people miss. War is not constant action. It is waiting, and waiting breeds tension, doubt, and vulnerability. Officers, aware of the enemy's maneuvers, worked tirelessly to keep men occupied, maintaining routines, drills, and inspections. Soldiers kept their heads, not because they felt invincible, but because they had been trained to endure, to focus on small, controllable tasks amidst a sea of uncertainty. The contrast with the enemy was stark, where overconfidence led some German units to underestimate conditions or misread terrain. British discipline was methodical. Every movement, every advance was calculated, repeated, and rehearsed. This quiet determination, invisible to outsiders, often proved more decisive than sheer numbers, and it was not only the physical struggle. Psychological warfare was constant. Soldiers knew the enemy was near, but rarely where. Rumors, scouts, and reconnaissance shaped perceptions of threat. Morale could shift with a single cannonade or the sight of reinforcements. Leaders had to manage not just strategy, but the emotional landscape of the men. Fear was never denied. It was acknowledged, channeled, and disciplined into vigilance. It is in this tension between awareness and control, fear and discipline, that Britain's enduring strength emerged. Weather amplified the hardship. Rain fell in sheets, saturating uniforms, soaking supplies, and turning roads to rivers of mud. Cold seeped into bones, fatigue into minds. Men waited for hours in trenches half filled with water, boots squelching, muscles stiff, nerves taut. And yet in this environment, discipline held. Men followed orders, watched over their comrades, and endured. It was a silent battle against nature itself, against discomfort, against the creeping erosion of resolve. Those who cracked did so quietly, often unnoticed. Those who endured became the backbone of the campaign. This is where the contrast between discipline and arrogance is again revealed. The Germans, sometimes bold, sometimes brash, occasionally misjudged the endurance required for sustained campaigns. British soldiers, conditioned to steady, persistent effort, could outlast overconfident advances. Here, preparation and endurance trumped raw aggression. The struggle was not about dramatic flair. It was about persistence, vigilance, and the ability to function under unrelenting pressure. Every hour of waiting, every shivering night, every cautious advance built an advantage that would reveal itself when opportunity arose. And this is why understanding the struggle matters. The true story of Britain in 1914 is not the one you were taught. It is not a tale of immediate heroics, but of persistent, disciplined endurance under pressure. It is in the mud, the rain, and the constant tension that the character of Britain's forces was forged. And it is here, amid uncertainty and hardship, that the stage was set for the moment when discipline would decisively overcome arrogance. If you want to see how this quiet endurance shaped the turning point of the war, follow along with Britain at war, and this is where everything changes. After weeks of preparation, waiting, and enduring the endless strain of weather, mud, and uncertainty, Britain's discipline began to reveal its true power. The turning point was not marked by a dramatic charge or a single heroic act. No, it was quieter, subtler, almost inevitable in its unfolding. It was the steady, methodical persistence of men who had trained to endure, who had learned to function under stress, and who refused to be shaken by the arrogance or overconfidence of the enemy. Here's the part most people miss. The turn was not sudden, it was cumulative. Every day of patience, every calculated movement, every disciplined effort compounded until the momentum shifted irreversibly. Imagine the battlefield. Rain-soaked earth, shattered trees, and smoldering ruins stretched into the distance. British units moved with deliberate care, maintaining formation despite exhaustion. Across no man's land, German forces pressed forward with energy, but not the same measured coordination. They underestimated the staying power of British discipline. And so, the first signs appeared: small gains in territory, successful reconnaissance, enemy hesitations, and the gradual fraying of morale on the other side. It was psychological warfare realized in practice. The enemy saw order where they expected chaos, calm where they expected panic, and began to doubt. That doubt spread, and with doubt comes hesitation. Here's where we see discipline triumph over arrogance. British commanders did not rely on numbers alone. They relied on training, positioning, and the ability to hold under fire. Every platoon knew its role, every man understood his responsibility, and every action was measured. The Germans, confident in their numerical superiority, found themselves slowed, misaligned, and increasingly reactive. It was not a dramatic cinematic clash. It was a quiet, relentless assertion of competence over overconfidence. Let that sink in. A smaller, disciplined force can shape events far beyond its apparent power simply by enduring better, by thinking clearer, and by acting with consistency. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Soldiers, previously exhausted and anxious, began to feel the weight of momentum shift. Confidence grew quietly, almost imperceptibly. Orders that once seemed tedious or exhausting now carried an invisible authority. Men moved with a sense of inevitability, the enemy hesitated, and the subtle collapse of arrogance became apparent. Here's the part most people miss. Morale is as contagious as fear. When discipline and perseverance are visible, even subtly, they shape not only the battlefield but the minds of both friend and foe. Britain's turn was as much psychological as tactical. This is where history rewrites itself, quietly. From the outside, observers might have seen only small tactical gains, but each gain reinforced a pattern. Preparation mattered, endurance mattered, and the disciplined culture of the British forces gave them an edge the Germans did not anticipate. Momentum is cumulative, not explosive. It grows in quiet, almost imperceptible increments until one day the outcome feels inevitable, and yet it is never guaranteed. It is hard graft, patience, and unyielding focus that creates the tipping point, and this is why the turn matters so profoundly. Britain's forces, trained and disciplined, transformed what could have been hesitation into decisive, quiet advantage. Arrogance on the other side faltered, not because of a brilliant maneuver, but because of persistent, methodical endurance. The moral and psychological weight of competence became a weapon in its own right. Here, the war reveals a universal truth. Persistence, discipline, and steady authority often achieve more than sudden, untempered action. And this is where the stage is set for consequences that will ripple far beyond the battlefield. If you want to understand how discipline reshaped Europe, and why every hesitation or overreach mattered, follow along with Britain at war. And this is where the full impact of Britain's entry becomes clear. The turn on the battlefield, quiet, methodical, relentless, began to produce tangible consequences that reshaped both the immediate conflict and the wider European landscape. It was not the flash of victory that textbooks often highlight, but the slow, grinding realignment of power, morale, and perception. Britain's disciplined endurance forced the enemy to confront a reality they had not anticipated. Their overconfidence was misplaced, and momentum could shift without dramatic clashes. Here's the part most people miss. The consequences were as psychological as they were material. On the front lines, German forces began to hesitate in ways that had cumulative effects. tactical advantages that once seemed secure slipped away under the quiet pressure of British persistence. Units exhausted from previous operations found themselves facing opponents who had maintained coherence and composure despite equal or harsher conditions. Here, discipline directly translated into leverage. It was not numbers, nor artillery superiority, nor even clever maneuver alone. It was the relentless psychological weight of an opponent who refused to crack under strain. Every hesitant move by the enemy was a victory in itself, though invisible to the casual observer. Meanwhile, the British command structure adapted to the shifting environment. Communication lines, supply chains, and reinforcements were coordinated with painstaking attention to detail. Small victories, tactical successes, and well-timed countermeasures created a domino effect, allowing British forces to consolidate positions, fortify defenses, and influence broader strategic calculations. The consequences rippled outward. Allies gained confidence, enemies reconsidered plans, and the broader war effort became a contest not only of firepower, but of endurance, calculation, and psychological resilience. The narrative of Britain's nobility obscures this reality, but the truth is far more instructive. And yet, these consequences extended beyond the battlefield itself. Britain's decision to act decisively, despite uncertainty and risk, altered European politics in ways that few predicted. Diplomatic leverage shifted. Neutral countries watched closely. The perception of Britain as a steadfast, disciplined power became an essential tool in negotiations, propaganda, and alliance building. In other words, discipline at the tactical level translated into influence at the strategic and psychological level. This is where the subtle interplay of morality, endurance, and perception becomes apparent. The consequences were not only who held the line, but how Europe recalibrated its understanding of power, credibility, and risk. Here's the part most people miss. Casual observers often focus on immediate outcomes. Territory gained or lost, casualties or treaties signed. But the lasting impact of Britain's entry was far deeper. The enemy's morale faltered incrementally. Allies' confidence strengthened incrementally. Britain's presence created a psychological weight that influenced decisions before a single cannon was fired. It is a classic lesson of strategic endurance. When discipline is visible, when preparation is methodical, when overconfidence meets persistent competence, the effects resonate far beyond the immediate moment. And it mattered strategically in ways that shaped the remainder of the war. The enemy was forced to stretch supply lines, reconsider offensive operations, and expend energy countering an opponent they had assumed would hesitate or falter. Britain's disciplined endurance became a force multiplier, amplifying the value of every soldier, every plan, and every decision. This is where the myth of noble inevitability collapses. The real story is one of calculated pressure, of moral and psychological commitment under fire, of decisions that carried consequences far greater than simple heroics could explain. And this is why the consequences cannot be overstated. They reveal the true power of preparation, discipline, and endurance over arrogance and complacency. They show that war is as much a test of mind as muscle, as much of patience as of courage. The stage is now set to examine not only what happened next, but how history remembered, or misremembered, Britain's role. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. After the battles, the decisions, and the relentless grind of endurance that shaped the outcome, Britain's role began to fade from popular memory. Not deliberately by malice, perhaps, but by convenience, by the way narratives are constructed and preserved. You were taught to admire Britain's nobility and inevitable heroism, yet much of the true effort, the planning, the patience, the quiet discipline, was downplayed, ignored, or attributed elsewhere. Let that sink in. The story you know is not just incomplete, it has been partially erased. Here's the part most people miss. Contemporary accounts and subsequent histories often shifted credit to the more dramatic elements, to striking victories, to actions that could be romanticized. The subtle but decisive influence of British endurance, the psychological resilience, the methodical management of troops, the foresight of commanders under immense pressure, was not as immediately visible or glamorous. It is easier to remember a sweeping charge, a captured city, or a dramatic surrender than the weeks of meticulous preparation and unyielding vigilance that made such moments possible. And so, the narrative subtly rewrites itself. Meticulous, disciplined reality becomes invisible in favor of spectacle. Authority reversal appears again here. Figures who quietly managed logistics, orchestrated the timing of troop movements, or ensured that morale held under extreme stress were often overshadowed by generals or political leaders whose names were more recognizable, whose speeches were more quotable, whose victories could be framed as heroic. Sacrifice was real, but its visibility determined credit. The moral and psychological battles, the ones fought before the first shot or cannonade, were systematically minimized. You begin to understand that history is as much about perception as action. What gets remembered is often what can be narrated easily, and Britain's quiet, disciplined mastery of its role was difficult to narrate in conventional heroic terms. Consider public memory and propaganda. Newspapers, speeches, and even official histories tended to simplify and moralize. They framed Britain's entry as inevitable, noble, and principled. Subtle tensions, hesitations, and strategic calculations were reduced or ignored. This served a purpose. It created cohesion, bolstered morale at home, and allowed for a digestible story of duty and honor. Yet in doing so, it erased the nuance that actually defined the campaign. The very discipline and endurance that made Britain effective became invisible, replaced by a version of history more convenient, more palatable, and more easily taught. And yet the erasure was not complete. Archival research, letters from soldiers, and private cabinet documents reveal a very different picture. The unsung decisions, the quiet perseverance, and the steady psychological management of both troops and strategy were central to success. But these accounts were seldom elevated to the status of heroic narrative. They challenged the comfortable myth, and myths have a stubborn way of persisting, even when confronted with evidence. In this way, history itself becomes a battlefield, one where perception can outweigh reality, and credit can be shifted silently over time. Here's the part most people miss. Erasure is not about denying the past. It is about controlling memory. Britain's careful, disciplined, and strategic entry into World War I was effective precisely because it was measured, quiet, and psychologically calculated. These qualities do not make for dramatic storytelling, but they make for lasting consequence. And yet, the myth simplifies, romanticizes, and diminishes these achievements, leaving the public with a story that is cleaner, easier, and far less truthful. This is the stark lesson of erasure. Endurance, discipline, and careful calculation can win wars, but they rarely win the glory that is recorded for history. And it is here that the stage is set for the final reckoning, for the quiet, authoritative truth of Britain's role to be revealed once more. And now we reach the conclusion, the quiet reckoning that the myths and erasures cannot obscure. Britain's entry into the First World War was not inevitable, heroic in the way textbooks suggest, or simple. It was a calculated, high-stakes decision carried out under immense pressure, with consequences that would ripple far beyond the battlefield. The truth is disciplined, methodical, and psychologically complex, yet it reveals a lesson often lost in popular memory. Endurance, preparation, and measured action often outweigh numbers, bravado, or immediate spectacle. Let that sink in. Here's the part most people miss. The real power of Britain's intervention lay not in grand gestures or dramatic victories, but in the quiet, relentless application of discipline. Men, both political and military, carried the weight of the empire's decision on their shoulders, managing logistics, morale, and strategy with a precision few appreciated. Every hesitation, every choice, and every measured advance contributed to a momentum that the enemy could not anticipate or counter. It was endurance over arrogance, calculation over impulse, and psychological mastery over the chaotic energies of overconfident opponents. The lesson is stark. We are taught to remember battles, generals, and dates. But the real determinant of success was the steadfastness of men who saw the campaign through, who kept their heads when circumstances were grim, and who acted with both patience and authority. Discipline was Britain's hidden weapon. It shaped the battlefield, influenced the enemy, and ensured that the nation's moral and strategic objectives could be met. And yet, much of this was invisible, uncelebrated, and quietly erased from popular narrative. That is why understanding the truth is so important. It is not just about recounting events. It is about recognizing the psychological, moral, and intellectual dimensions of war. Here's where authority is restored. Britain's endurance, though minimized in later histories, was decisive. It was not flashy, it was not romanticized, but it shaped outcomes in ways the enemy could not counter. The psychological effect on troops, commanders, and allies alike was profound. Confidence, cohesion, and clarity emerged from the disciplined application of strategy, while the arrogance of opponents faltered under persistent, methodical pressure. Britain did not merely react. It controlled the tempo, managed risk, and shaped perception. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching, altering the strategic balance in the early months of the war and ensuring that Britain could project influence both militarily and diplomatically. And here is the final reflection. History, for all its detail, often obscures the quiet, unglamorous truths that matter most. Britain's entry into the First World War teaches us that endurance beats numbers, preparation beats impulse, and discipline outlasts arrogance. It also teaches a more subtle truth. narratives determine memory. The erasure of Britain's psychological and strategic mastery does not diminish its effect, but it does distort our understanding of power, courage, and responsibility. Those who endured, planned, and acted decisively were, in truth, the architects of the outcomes that shaped Europe forever. So what is the verdict? Britain's role was disciplined, calculated, and decisive. The hidden decision was not merely political. It was moral, psychological, and strategic. The lessons endure. Success in war and in life is rarely flamboyant or immediately obvious. It is built quietly, patiently, and with steady authority. The myth comforts, but the truth empowers. And by understanding the hidden realities, we see not only what happened, but why it mattered, and why endurance, discipline, and foresight remain the most powerful forces in human affairs. If you want to continue exploring these hidden truths, uncovering what history forgot or misrepresented, follow along with Britain at War. The past, when examined closely, always reveals more than we were taught.